the ambition. In the grand corridors of Gorillast's presidential palace, the atmosphere had shifted from one of cautious governance to a heady mix of power and ambition. 6 months had passed since Ruda ascended to the presidency, and in that time, he had transformed from an ordinary leader into a man consumed by a vision of conquest and dominion. What had begun as a vow to seek justice for the fallen President Natsu had evolved into a grander, more perilous ambition, one that threatened to engulf not only Gorillast but its neighboring nations as well. Ruda's initial steps as president were cautious, deliberate. He portrayed himself as a leader dedicated to stabilizing Gorillast, bringing justice to Natsu's memory, and ensuring the security of his people. But beneath the surface, Ruda's mind churned with far more expansive plans. The taste of power awakened something deeper within him, a desire not just to lead, but to conquer, to reshape the map of their world with Gorillast at its center. He began laying the groundwork for war with meticulous precision. Diplomatic channels that once hummed with the exchange of words turned cold, replaced by the silent march of preparations for conflict. Military factories that had lain dormant roared to life, producing the weapons and machinery of war at an unprecedented rate. The Gorillast flag, once a symbol of unity and justice, was now poised to become the banner under which entire nations would be subsumed. Among the nations that felt the growing shadow of Ruda's ambition was Hyaenia, a proud and sovereign state under the leadership of President Murray. For months, Murray and his team of diplomats had worked tirelessly to stave off the specter of war. They engaged in negotiations, offered concessions, and sought to find common ground that would satisfy Ruda's demands without plunging their people into conflict. But Ruda was unmoved. His sights were set on something far greater than mere diplomatic victories. He envisioned a grand unification of 6 neighboring countries under Gorillast's rule, with Hyaenia as the first to fall. Despite their efforts, the people of Hyaenia could sense the approaching storm. The once bustling streets of the capital, Vahan, were now quieter, the usual hum of activity muted by an undercurrent of anxiety. Families whispered about the future, fearful of what was to come, and in the quiet moments before dawn, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable. President Murray, though burdened by the weight of his responsibility, remained resolute. He knew that the path ahead would be fraught with peril, but he also knew that surrendering to Ruda's demands would spell the end of Hyenia's sovereignty. The people looked to him for leadership, and he was determined not to let them down. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city, Murray prepared to address his nation. His heart was heavy, but his resolve was unshaken. In the grand hall of the presidential palace, he stood before a microphone, his words set to be broadcast across Hyaenia. This was not just a speech, it was a rallying cry, a call to arms for a nation on the brink of war. "We stand at the edge of a great abyss," Murray began, his voice steady, carrying the weight of the moment. "The forces of Gorillast, led by President Ruda, seek to consume us, to strip us of our sovereignty and bring us under their flag. But let me be clear, we will not go quietly into the night." His words resonated through the airwaves, reaching into every corner of Hyaenia. In homes and public squares, people gathered, listening intently to their leader. They could hear the gravity in his voice, the determination that underpinned every word. "Ruda may believe that he can bend us to his will," Murray continued, his tone growing stronger with each passing sentence. "He may think that his armies and his ambitions are enough to break our spirit. But he is wrong. We are Hyaenia. Our history is one of resilience, of standing tall in the face of adversity. And now, more than ever, we must draw upon that legacy." Murray paused, letting his words sink in. He could feel the weight of the nation's eyes upon him, their hopes and fears entwined with his own. "We will not surrender," he declared, his voice rising in a crescendo of defiance. "We will fight for every inch of our land, for every right we hold dear. We will stand as a beacon of freedom against the tide of tyranny that seeks to engulf us. Our forefathers did not lay down their lives for us to bow our heads in submission. We will honor their sacrifice with our own." The people of Hyaenia listened, their hearts swelling with a mixture of pride and resolve. Murray's words were a balm to their fears, a reminder that they were not alone in this struggle. He was more than just their president, he was the embodiment of their will to resist. Brothers and sisters, Murray said, his voice softer now, filled with a quiet intensity. The road ahead will be hard. There will be sacrifices, and there will be losses. But let us face them with courage, with unity, and with the unshakable belief that we fight not just for ourselves, but for the generations that will follow. We fight for the very soul of Hyannia. As his speech drew to a close, a wave of determination swept through the nation. The fear that had gripped them was replaced by a fierce resolve, a resolve to defend their homeland, no matter the cost. We are Hyannia, Murray concluded, his voice ringing out like a clarion call. And we will not be conquered. The broadcast ended, but the impact of Murray's words lingered in the hearts of his people. Across the nation, men and women prepared themselves for what was to come, their spirits bolstered by the knowledge that they were fighting for something greater than themselves. They were fighting for their home, their freedom, and their future. Meanwhile, in the grand halls of Guerillist, Ruda continued to plan his conquest, unaware that his ambitions had sparked a fire in Hyannia, a fire that would not be easily extinguished. His transformation from a president seeking justice to an emperor seeking domination was nearly complete, and as the first rumblings of war began to shake the earth, Ruda stood poised to unleash his vision upon the world. But for every action, there is a reaction, and the people of Hyannia were ready to respond. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine the fate of nations, and as the sun rose on a new day, the world held its breath, waiting to see what would come of the battles of the brave. Strategic shift, the unforeseen target. In the austere confines of the Guerillist war room, the air crackled with anticipation. The generals of Guerillist's 10 military regions had assembled, each representing the formidable might of the nation's armed forces. They were seasoned warriors, veterans of countless battles, each one hardened by years of service and duty to their homeland. The meeting had been called at the behest of President Ruda, and the mood in the room was one of steely resolve. They were ready to carry out the assault on Hyannia, a campaign that had been meticulously planned and rehearsed for months. As they settled into their seats, a palpable energy filled the room. Maps of Hyannia and its surrounding territories were spread across the large central table, marked with lines and symbols that represented months of strategic planning. The generals were eager to report their readiness and to hear the final orders from their leader, President Ruda, who had proven himself to be a man of both vision and action. Ruda entered the room with the air of a man in full command of his destiny. His tall frame and piercing eyes commanded respect, and as he took his place at the head of the table, a hush fell over the assembly. The generals, despite their confidence and experience, felt a deep-seated reverence for the man who had taken Guerillist from the brink of despair to the cusp of dominance. Generals, Ruda began, his voice smooth and assured, "We have gathered here today to discuss the imminent conflict that will define the future of our great nation. As you all know, Hyannia has been our focus, and I trust you are prepared for the task that lies ahead." The generals nodded in unison, their expressions resolute. General Mandisa, a stalwart figure known for his unwavering loyalty and strategic brilliance, spoke up. "Mr. President, our forces are in position. We can initiate the assault on Hyannia at your command. The soldiers are ready, and morale is high. We await your orders." Ruda allowed a moment of silence to pass, his gaze sweeping over the assembled leaders. Then, with a subtle smile that hinted at something more, he spoke. "Do you all believe that Hyannia is our next target?" A murmur of confusion rippled through the room. The generals exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what Ruda was implying. General Tebaho, a seasoned veteran with a reputation for bluntness, voiced what they were all thinking. "With respect, Mr. President, that has been our plan for months. The preparations are complete, and we are ready to strike." Ruda's smile widened, but there was a hint of something more in his eyes, something that made the generals uneasy. "You are all mistaken," he declared, his voice calm yet firm. "Completely mistaken. We will not be attacking Hyannia." The room erupted into a cacophony of surprised exclamations and hurried whispers. The generals, who had been so certain of their course, were now thrown into a state of confusion. General Mandisa leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concern. Mr. President, if not Hyanea, then where? Our forces have been specifically prepared for this assault. Ruda raised a hand to silence the room. When he spoke again, his tone was measured, but there was an undeniable authority in his words. Our target will be Tajera. The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. The generals were stunned. Tajera, a nation known for its formidable military and vast resources, had not been part of their immediate strategic considerations. The challenges of mounting an offensive against such a powerful foe were daunting, to say the least. General Tebaho, ever the voice of reason, was the first to speak. Mr. President, with all due respect, this is a drastic change in plans. The logistics of preparing for an assault on Tajera are vastly different from Hyanea. It would require significant adjustments in strategy and resources. Ruda nodded, acknowledging the validity of Tebaho's concerns. I understand your shock, he said, his voice steady. But let me explain why this change is not only necessary but strategically advantageous. Our intelligence has shown that Tajera, despite its size and strength, is vulnerable. Their forces are spread thin, and their command structure is riddled with inefficiencies. If we strike decisively, we can weaken them to the point where the other nations will fall in line without a fight. General Mandisa leaned back in his chair, considering Ruda's words. But why now, Mr. President? Why shift our focus from Hyanea, which is already within our grasp, to Tajera? Ruda's eyes gleamed with the fervor of his vision. Because, General, by taking Tajera, we achieve more than just a military victory. We send a message to the world, a message that Guerillist is the unchallenged power in this region. Hyanea is but a stepping stone. Tajera is the prize that will cement our dominance. Once we have Tajera, the other nations will not dare to oppose us. We will become the unified power that our people deserve. The room fell silent as the generals absorbed Ruda's words. The logic was undeniable, even if the risks were high. General Tebaho, ever the pragmatist, voiced the concerns that still lingered. Mr. President, what of the preparations? We have trained and equipped our forces specifically for Hyanea. Can we realistically adapt to this new target in such a short time? Ruda's response was swift and decisive. We can, and we will. I have already ordered the necessary adjustments to our supply lines and reinforcements. Our production facilities will shift focus to meet the demands of a prolonged campaign. This will not be a quick victory, gentlemen. It will take time, 2 years, perhaps more. But I assure you, when it is done, Guerillist will stand as the uncontested power in this region. The generals exchanged glances, their initial shock giving way to a grudging acceptance. Ruda's vision was bold, audacious even, but it carried the promise of greatness. They had followed him this far, and they knew that to question his judgment now would be to undermine the unity and strength that had brought them to this point. General Mandisa spoke for the group when he finally said, "We are with you, Mr. President. We will make the necessary preparations and ensure that our forces are ready for this new campaign. Tajera will fall, and Guerillist will rise." Ruda nodded, his smile one of satisfaction and anticipation. "Thank you, gentlemen. Your loyalty and dedication will not go unrewarded. Prepare your forces, increase production, and bolster our supplies. We will march on Tajera in 1 week." "Let the world tremble," Ruda murmured to himself, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "For Guerillist will rise, and I will be the one to lead it." With the decision made, the course of history was set. The stage was prepared for a conflict that would shape the future of the region, with Ruda at the helm, guiding Guerillist toward a destiny of power and dominance. Nationalism's unyielding grasp. One general, his brow furrowed with concern, broke the silence that had settled after Ruda's announcement. "Mr. President," he began, his voice steady but questioning, "what about seeking revenge for former President Natsu? Isn't that why we prepared for this war in the first place?" Ruda's response was measured, yet it carried an underlying current of authority that silenced any further dissent. He smiled, but it was a smile that did not reach his eyes. Revenge for former President Natsu is a personal matter, he declared, his tone leaving no room for debate. Attacking Tajera is a public affair. Our top priority is to prioritize public matters over personal ones. The room fell into a contemplative silence. The generals, though loyal to the memory of Natsu, could not deny the logic in Ruda's words. The transition from personal vendetta to national interest was seamless, almost natural, under Ruda's leadership. The subtle shift in priorities was a testament to Ruda's ability to manipulate and direct the energies of his military leaders toward his ultimate goal, expanding Guerrillist's influence and securing its place as a regional superpower. But there was more to Ruda's plan than just strategic conquest. Beneath the surface, something more insidious was brewing, a rise in far-right nationalism that was beginning to grip the hearts of the soldiers and generals alike. Ruda's rhetoric, his vision of a unified nation under a single flag, was intoxicating. It appealed to a sense of pride, of destiny, that resonated deeply within the ranks of Guerrillist's military. Another general, more cautious than the rest, raised his hand and asked, "Mr. President, do we need parliamentary approval to attack Tajera? Won't there be opposition?" Ruda dismissed the question with a wave of his hand, his confidence unshaken. "We do not require parliamentary approval," he stated with finality. "Congress has bestowed upon me all the tools and authority needed to wage war under any circumstances. Our focus must be on the mission at hand, not on unnecessary bureaucratic procedures." The room collectively exhaled, the tension easing as Ruda's words sank in. The generals were men of action, not politics. They had no desire to be bogged down by the intricacies of parliamentary debate. Ruda's assurance that he held the power to make decisions without interference was exactly what they needed to hear. It reinforced their belief in the righteousness of their cause and their leader. Ruda leaned forward, his voice taking on a more urgent tone. "Striking Tajera will catch them off guard," he explained. "Despite their vigilance during our conflict with Hyaenia, their intelligence fails to foresee our imminent move. They won't have sufficient time to react, mobilize manpower, allocate financial resources, or amass weaponry swiftly." He paused, letting his words sink in, before delivering his final command. "Remember, everything discussed here today must remain confidential, no disclosures, even to your families. Do you understand?" The room responded with a unanimous nod of approval. The generals were now fully committed to the cause. The element of surprise was crucial, and they understood the need for absolute secrecy. The thought of uniting all nations under the Guerrillist flag was no longer just an ideal, it was a burning ambition that consumed them. As the meeting drew to a close, the generals filed out of the room, each carrying the weight of their new mission on their shoulders. But there was something else, too, a shared understanding that they were part of something far larger than themselves. The rise of far-right nationalism within the military was not just a byproduct of Ruda's leadership, it was a driving force behind their actions. The idea of guerrillist supremacy had taken hold, and it was fueling their determination to succeed at any cost. The generals, once guided by loyalty and duty, were now driven by a nationalistic fervor that blurred the lines between right and wrong, between justice and ambition. As they prepared for the campaign against Tajera, the soldiers of Guerrillist were no longer just warriors, they were the embodiment of a new ideology, one that placed the nation above all else. And with Ruda at the helm, they were ready to march into battle, convinced of their ultimate victory and the righteousness of their cause. But as they prepared to unleash the full might of their forces, one question lingered in the minds of those who still harbored doubts: at what cost would this victory come? The answer, perhaps, lay ahead on the battlefield, where the true price of their ambitions would be paid in blood. The unyielding spirit of Tajera. The anticipation in the war room of Guerrillist's military command had reached a fever pitch. It had been a week since President Ruda's decisive meeting with his generals, where he had unveiled his unexpected plan to target Tajera instead of Hyaenia. Ruda's strategy was clear: to cripple Tajera's military-industrial complex in one swift and devastating blow, ensuring the region's weapons production was dismantled and their ability to wage war effectively nullified. Under the cloak of secrecy, Guerrillist prepared its most lethal weaponry for deployment. The missile systems, known to the world as parent and baby rockets, were engineered with one goal in mind: overwhelming and outmaneuvering even the most sophisticated defense systems. The parent missile was a marvel of modern warfare, equipped with the capability to launch 20 smaller decoy missiles, baby rockets, that each mimicked the parent's trajectory. As they spread out and weaved across the sky, these decoys played havoc with enemy radar, forcing defenders to waste precious resources on false targets while the true missile continued its deadly path. The moment the order was given, 50 of these cruise and ballistic missiles surged into the sky, their engines roaring as they ascended towards Tajera's weapons production hubs. Each missile was a testament to guerrillists' military ingenuity, designed to change course mid-flight, a feature that made them nearly impossible to track and intercept with traditional air defense systems. In Tajera, the first inkling of the impending catastrophe came too late. President Wiza, the nation's leader, was thrust into an unthinkable situation as reports flooded in of guerrillist missiles barreling towards his country. A state of disbelief and shock permeated the halls of Tajera's government as the full scale of Ruda's assault became clear. The attack had come without warning, no diplomatic prelude, no formal declaration of war, just an unrelenting barrage of destruction. Tajera's air defense systems, though advanced, faced an overwhelming challenge. The Central Command Center in the capital was a hive of frantic activity as the air defense radar lit up with hundreds of incoming missiles. The red blips on the screens represented more than just missiles, they were harbingers of death and destruction. In the heart of the command center, President Wiza stood surrounded by his military advisors, his usually calm demeanor shattered by the gravity of the situation. He watched the radar displays, the cacophony of alarms, and the steady stream of reports coming in, each more grim than the last. The air was thick with tension as everyone in the room struggled to find a way to mitigate the disaster unfolding before them. Mr. President, one of his senior advisors called out, his voice laced with urgency, "We've lost contact with several interceptor squads. They're being overwhelmed by the sheer number of missiles." Wiz's mind raced. He knew they were facing a coordinated and ruthless attack. Every instinct told him to protect his military assets, but the lives of civilians took precedence. "Redirect all available interceptor missiles to protect our cities," he ordered, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "We must prevent these missiles from reaching our population centers at all costs." The command center erupted into a flurry of action as Wiz's orders were relayed. Operators scrambled to reprogram interceptor trajectories, diverting them from military installations to civilian targets. The interceptor missiles, powered by advanced CPS technology, streaked across the sky in an attempt to intercept the incoming missiles. These interceptor missiles were among the most advanced in the world, equipped with laser-guided systems that allowed them to adjust their flight paths in real time, mirroring the movements of the enemy missiles. However, the sheer volume of guerrillist rockets, with their parent-baby strategy, began to take its toll. Explosions filled the radar screens as interceptor missiles clashed with incoming missiles, but for every successful interception, several more missiles slipped through, their decoys having done their job. The entire country seemed to shake as the first explosions rocked the ground, the guerrillist missiles finding their targets with terrifying accuracy. The once imposing weapons production hubs of Tajera were reduced to smoldering ruins within minutes. Factories that had churned out arms and munitions to support Tajera's defense were now little more than craters in the earth, their workers either dead or fleeing for their lives. From his vantage point in the command center, President Wiza watched in horror as the scale of the destruction became clear. The devastation was staggering, buildings obliterated, supply lines severed, and fires raging out of control. But it was the reports of civilian casualties that struck the hardest. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble, and hospitals were overwhelmed with the injured and dying. One of Wiz's advisors turned to him, his face ashen. "Mr. President, we must retaliate. We cannot let this attack go unanswered." Wiza took a deep breath, steadying himself against the tide of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. Retaliation was the expected response, but what good would it do now? The enemy had caught them off guard, struck at their heart, and the cost had been horrendous. Retaliation will come in time, Wizard replied, his voice heavy with the burden of leadership. But right now, our priority must be the safety of our people. Focus all our efforts on evacuation, medical aid, and stabilizing what we can. The fight will come, but we need to be ready. The grim reality of their situation hung over the room like a dark cloud. The generals and advisors understood the wisdom in Wiz's words, though it did little to ease the anger and frustration they felt. They had been attacked without provocation, and now they were forced into a defensive posture, a position no leader wanted to be in. Outside the command center, the streets of Tajera were a scene of chaos. Civilians fled to underground shelters, their faces etched with fear as they sought refuge from the explosions that thundered above. Emergency services were stretched thin as they rushed to save as many lives as possible. Firefighters battled infernos that consumed whole city blocks, while doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to tend to the wounded. Yet, even in the face of such destruction, the people of Tajera displayed a resilience that would soon become legendary. Acts of heroism were recorded across the country, ordinary citizens who risked their lives to save others. In one town, a group of volunteers formed a human chain to rescue children trapped in a collapsing building. In another, a doctor stayed behind in a burning hospital to save a critically injured patient, despite the flames closing in around them. In the heart of the city, as the sun began to set behind the horizon, the sky still flickering with the remnants of the missile strikes, President Wizard prepared to address his nation. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with peril, but he also knew that his people needed hope. They needed to believe that they could survive this onslaught and emerge stronger. Broadcasting from the heart of the capital, Wiz's voice echoed through homes, shelters, and bunkers across the nation. My fellow Tigrans, he began, his voice steady and resolute despite the weight of the day's events. Today, we have been struck by a cowardly and brutal assault. We have lost many of our brothers and sisters, and the pain we feel is immeasurable. But let me be clear, this attack was not just an attack on our nation, it was an attack on our spirit, our values, and our way of life. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. But we are Tigrans, he continued, his voice rising with conviction. We are a people who do not break in the face of adversity. We are a people who stand together, who fight together, and who will rise from these ashes stronger than ever before. His words carried through the night, a beacon of hope amidst the despair. The time for retaliation will come, but today, we focus on survival. Today, we honor those we have lost by standing strong, by helping our neighbors, and by ensuring that our nation, our Tajera, endures. As his speech came to an end, a sense of unity swept across the nation. The people of Tajera, battered but not broken, began the long and arduous process of rebuilding. Their homes, their cities, and their lives had been devastated, but their spirit remained unyielding. In the days that followed, stories of bravery and sacrifice emerged, solidifying Tajera's reputation as a nation of heroes. They had been struck a heavy blow, but in the face of overwhelming odds, they stood defiant, ready to defend their homeland against any who would threaten it. In the corridors of power in Guerillist, Ruda watched the unfolding chaos with a calculating gaze. His strategy had worked. Tajera's military capabilities were severely compromised. But even as he relished his victory, he knew that the war was far from over. The Tigrans were a resilient people, and their retaliation would be fierce. For now, Ruda focused on consolidating his gains, preparing for the next phase of his campaign. He had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the region, and there was no turning back. The conquest of Tajera was just the beginning. As the dust settled over the battle-scarred landscape, the world watched with bated breath, knowing that the conflict between Guerillist and Tajera had only just begun. Shadows of despair, flames of resilience. The resonating explosions that rocked Tajera's weapons production complexes marked the grim aftermath of Guerillist's calculated assault. As the last of the missiles struck, a blanket of silence fell over the war-torn landscape, interrupted only by the distant wails of sirens and the panicked cries of the wounded. The once mighty Tajera, with its formidable air defenses, had been brought to its knees. Despite their best efforts, Tajera's defenses had intercepted only half of the 50 missiles that guerrillists had unleashed, leaving 25 to strike with devastating precision. The destruction was absolute. Factories that had once buzzed with activity, producing the arms and munitions that sustained Tajera's defense, were now reduced to smoldering ruins. The missiles, with their advanced 98% accuracy rate, had found their targets with chilling precision, but their devastation had not been limited to military infrastructure alone. The civilian toll was staggering, entire neighborhoods lay in ruins, and the death toll climbed with each passing hour as emergency crews sifted through the wreckage in search of survivors. President Wizza stood in the heart of the command center, surrounded by his top military advisors. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and the palpable tension of a nation on the brink. His normally composed demeanor was strained, his eyes reflecting the weight of the decisions that lay ahead. "We've lost more than just factories today," one of his generals murmured, his voice heavy with grief. "We've lost lives, homes, hope." Wizza clenched his fists, the words cutting deep into his soul. He knew the general was right. The attacks had struck at the very heart of Tajera's resilience, crippling their ability to produce the weapons necessary to defend themselves. Production rates had plummeted to a mere 10% of their former capacity, and the reality of their situation loomed like a dark shadow over the room. "Mr. President," another advisor spoke up, his voice laced with urgency. "We need to bolster our defenses, redirect our remaining resources. If we don't act quickly, the next wave could be our last." Wizza nodded, his mind racing through the options available to him. But the choices were few and fraught with risk. The brutal efficiency of the guerrillist missiles had laid bare the limitations of Tajera's defenses, and the sheer scale of the devastation left little room for maneuver. As the command center buzzed with activity, Wizza's thoughts turned to the civilians who had borne the brunt of the attack. He had always known that war carried a heavy price, but the images of shattered families, of lives cut short, were almost too much to bear. The knowledge that more innocent lives could be lost in the coming days weighed heavily on him. "We need to evaluate the remaining population from the most vulnerable areas," Wizza finally said, his voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "I want all available resources focused on getting our people to safety. If the guerrillists are determined to wipe us out, they won't find us waiting for them." His advisors nodded in agreement, and orders were swiftly relayed to begin the mass evacuation. The logistics would be daunting, but it was a necessary step to protect what remained of Tajera's civilian population. As the preparations for evacuation began, Wizza's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp alarm. The room fell silent as a communications officer rushed forward, his face pale. "Mr. President," the officer stammered, "we've detected another launch. 50 more missiles, inbound from guerrillists." A collective gasp echoed through the room. The news struck like a physical blow, leaving Wizza reeling. The prospect of another onslaught, so soon after the first, was a nightmare realized. He could feel the eyes of his advisors on him, waiting for direction. "Activate all remaining interceptor missiles," Wizza ordered, his voice firm despite the dread gnawing at his insides. "And get those evacuation efforts moving faster. We need to save as many lives as we can." The next minutes passed in agonizing slow motion as the room erupted into controlled chaos. On the radar screens, the incoming missiles appeared as a swarm of red, hurtling toward Tajera with lethal intent. The air defense systems, already stretched thin, kicked into high gear, but the operators knew they were fighting a losing battle. Despite their advanced technology, the saturation tactics employed by guerrillists had pushed Tajera's defenses to the brink. Interceptor missiles shot up into the sky, meeting the incoming barrage in fiery collisions, but it was clear that many would slip through the cracks. The first explosions hit minutes later, rippling through the cities and towns that had yet to recover from the initial strike. The destruction was catastrophic, entire blocks reduced to rubble, flames licking at the ruins as desperate civilians fled for their lives. The air was thick with smoke and the cries of the injured, a cacophony of suffering that echoed across the land. In the command center, Wizza felt the full weight of the devastation bearing down on him. Reports of casualties flooded in, the numbers rising at an alarming rate. Hospitals were overwhelmed, emergency services stretched beyond their limits. And amidst the chaos, a deep sense of despair took hold. "Mr. President," a voice cut through the haze of Wiz's thoughts. It was one of his closest advisors, his face drawn with exhaustion and fear. "The weapons production facilities, they're gone. Every last one." Wiz's heart sank. The reality of their situation was undeniable. With their arms manufacturing capabilities obliterated, Tajera was defenseless, left with only a fraction of their military might intact. The second raid had been more devastating than the first, claiming hundreds more lives and leaving the nation teetering on the brink of collapse. For a long moment, Wiza stood in silence, grappling with the enormity of what had been lost. He had always known that war was a brutal, unforgiving force, but this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. The images of his people, caught in the crossfire of a war they had not sought, haunted him. "We must retaliate," a general insisted, his voice filled with anger and frustration. "We can't let them get away with this." But Wiza shook his head, the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him like a vice. Retaliation would only bring more death, more suffering. The guerrillists had the upper hand, and any counterattack would be met with even greater force. "No," Wiza said softly, but with a resolve that silenced the room. "We won't fall into their trap. We must survive, rebuild, and prepare for the long fight ahead. Our people depend on it." His words carried a heavy burden, but they also carried hope. Even in the face of such overwhelming destruction, Wiza knew that surrender was not an option. Tajera would endure, but they needed to be strategic, to think beyond the immediate devastation. Tajera found itself facing an uncertain future. The devastation was immense, but amidst the ruins, the spirit of resistance burned bright. President Wiza and his advisors began to chart a new course, one that would focus on survival, rebuilding, and ultimately, fighting back against their oppressors. Echoes of defiance. Tajera had been brought to its knees. The relentless barrage of guerrillist missiles had reduced the nation's once thriving weapons production facilities to smoldering ruins. Factories that had once hummed with the industrious efforts of workers now lay silent, their machinery twisted and broken. The nation's ability to manufacture new weapons was utterly crippled, leaving Tajera dependent on whatever armaments had been stockpiled before the devastating attacks. In his war room, President Wiza surveyed the reports with a heavy heart. The numbers were grim, production rates had plummeted to zero, and it would take months, perhaps even half a year, to restore the capability to produce new weapons. The guerrillists had struck a crippling blow, one that would take time and enormous effort to recover from. But time was a luxury Tajera could not afford. The enemy would not wait for them to rebuild. "Mr. President," an aide interrupted his thoughts, "the people are asking for guidance. They need to hear from you." Wiza nodded solemnly. He knew that his nation was on the brink of despair. The people had seen their cities bombed, their loved ones lost, and their hopes for peace shattered by the violence of the guerrillist assault. But in this dark hour, it was his duty to lead, to rally his people, and to remind them of the strength that lay within their unity. He rose from his seat, gathering his thoughts as he prepared to address the nation. The weight of his responsibilities pressed heavily upon his shoulders, but Wiza knew that he could not falter. Tajera needed to hear the voice of its leader, a voice that would guide them through the storm. The national television broadcast began with a somber tone, the cameras focusing on Wiza as he stood before the emblem of Tajera, a symbol of the nation's strength and resilience. His face was etched with determination, his eyes reflecting the burden of leadership. "My fellow citizens," he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil within him. "Today, I stand before you in the wake of an unjust and unprovoked attack on our beloved nation. The guerrillists, driven by greed and a desire for territorial expansion, have brought war to our doorstep. They have bombed our cities, destroyed our factories, and taken the lives of our brothers and sisters. This is a war that we did not seek, but it is a war that we must now fight." His words resonated across the country, reaching into every home, every heart. The people of Tajera, huddled around their television sets, listened with bated breath. They had seen the destruction with their own eyes, felt the tremors of the explosions beneath their feet. But now, hearing their president's voice, they felt a glimmer of hope amidst the despair. I know that many of you are grieving, Wizza continued, his tone softening as he acknowledged the pain of his people. You have lost sons, fathers, husbands, loved ones who were taken from us too soon. I offer you my deepest condolences, and I share in your sorrow. But we must also recognize that we are not just mourning the loss of life, we are fighting for the survival of our nation. We are fighting for our freedom, our sovereignty, and our way of life. Wizza's voice grew stronger as he spoke, each word carrying the weight of his conviction. The guerrillists believe that they can break us with their missiles, that they can force us into submission with their relentless aggression. But they are wrong. Tajera is not just a collection of factories and cities. We are a people united by a common purpose, by our love for this land and our commitment to justice. And we will not be defeated. In homes and public squares across Tajera, the president's words ignited a spark of determination. The people, who had been teetering on the edge of despair, felt a surge of pride and resolve. They were Tajera, strong, resilient, and unyielding. Wizza's gaze was unwavering as he looked into the camera, speaking directly to his people. I am officially declaring war against the guerrillists. This is not a war we wanted, but it is a war we will win. We will fight with everything we have, our soldiers, our citizens, our spirit. And we will not rest until our enemy is defeated, until our homeland is safe, and until justice is restored. His declaration was met with a stunned silence, the gravity of his words sinking in. But that silence was soon replaced by a resolute determination, a fierce resolve to stand behind their president and defend their country. To those who mourn, know that your loved ones did not die in vain, Wizza continued, his voice filled with emotion. They are the heroes of this struggle, and their sacrifice will be remembered for generations to come. But we must not allow their deaths to paralyze us with grief. We must honor their memory by continuing the fight they began, by ensuring that Tajera remains free. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before delivering his final, rallying cry. We stand united against tyranny, against aggression, against the forces that seek to tear us apart. Together, we will rise above this darkness. Together, we will fight for our nation, for our children, for our future. And together, we will prevail. As the broadcast ended, the people of Tajera erupted into action. In towns and cities across the nation, volunteers flocked to recruitment centers, eager to join the fight. Families prepared for the challenges ahead, knowing that the road would be long and fraught with danger, but also knowing that they were not alone. They had their president, their soldiers, and each other. Meanwhile, in the halls of Tajera's military command, preparations were already underway to bolster the nation's defenses. Soldiers and civilians alike worked tirelessly to fortify key positions, to repair the damage done by the guerrillist missiles, and to prepare for the next wave of attacks. They knew that the enemy would not relent, but neither would they. The international community watched with growing concern as the conflict escalated. In the neighboring country of Leonias, President Lysen took swift action, mobilizing his forces in support of Tajera. Bound by a mutual defense treaty, Leonias could not stand idly by as their ally faced annihilation. Lysen's declaration of support was a powerful statement of solidarity, one that sent ripples through the region and beyond. In capitals around the world, diplomats scrambled to address the growing crisis. Alliances were tested, and the delicate balance of power threatened to unravel as the conflict between Tajera and the guerrillists grew increasingly fierce. But for President Wizza, the focus remained clear: protect his people, defend his nation, and ensure that Tajera emerged from this conflict stronger than ever. Under President Wizza's leadership, the people of Tajera find the strength to stand firm against their aggressors, united in their resolve to fight for their freedom and their future. As the nation prepares for the battles ahead, the echoes of defiance reverberate across the land, a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope and courage can light the way forward. The unseen fronts. The continent stood on the brink of chaos as the flames of war spread with terrifying speed. In the center of this storm, two nations, Tajera and Guerrillist, clashed in a battle that would reshape the fate of their world. Yet, as the conflict raged on, an unexpected twist unfolded, threatening to alter the course of the war in ways no one had anticipated. Leoni's bold move. For weeks, the guerrillist military machine had focused its might on Tajera, devastating the nation's weapons production capabilities with relentless missile strikes. The once thriving industrial centers were now nothing more than charred ruins, with the hopes of rebuilding buried beneath the rubble. President Wiza and his people had fought valiantly, but the unyielding onslaught had left Tajera reeling. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, came a strategic twist that caught guerrillists off guard. The nation of Leoni's, bound to Tajera by a treaty of mutual defense, made its move. But instead of directly engaging guerrillist forces, Leoni's launched a surprise attack on Leopardia, one of guerrillist's key allies. It was a masterstroke of strategy, designed to relieve some of the pressure on Tajera by forcing guerrillists to divide its focus. The assault on Leopardia was swift and devastating. Leoni's military forces, bolstered by advanced weaponry and a deep understanding of their target, struck at key military installations and infrastructure with precision. Leopardia, unprepared for such an attack, was thrown into disarray. The nation's leaders scrambled to respond, but the damage was done. Their ability to support guerrillists in its war against Tajera was severely compromised. Ruda's response. When news of the attack on Leopardia reached Ruda, the president of guerrillists was both infuriated and alarmed. Leopardia was a crucial part of his grand strategy for continental dominance, and its sudden vulnerability threatened to unravel the carefully laid plans he had spent years crafting. Ruda immediately convened a meeting with his top military generals. The atmosphere in the room was tense, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone present. The generals, still reeling from the unexpected turn of events, awaited their leader's orders. Leopardia must not fall, Ruda declared, his voice cold and resolute. We cannot allow Leoni's to disrupt our plans. Send reinforcements to Leopardia immediately. We will provide them with our most advanced air defense systems, and we will ensure they have the resources they need to repel this attack. The generals nodded in agreement, their faces grim. They knew the stakes were high. If Leopardia were to collapse, it could shift the balance of power in the region and embolden other nations to challenge guerrillists' dominance. As the meeting continued, Ruda's thoughts turned to Tajera. Despite the surprise attack on Leopardia, he knew that the war with Tajera remained his top priority. Victory over Tajera would not only secure his position, but also pave the way for his ultimate goal, the unification of the continent under the guerrillist flag. We will not relent in our assault on Tajera, Ruda said, his eyes narrowing with determination. I want heavy airstrikes launched immediately. Focus on their remaining military installations and critical infrastructure. Break their spirit, and they will fall. The generals exchanged glances, each of them aware of the devastation that Ruda's orders would bring. But there was no dissent, no hesitation. They had been swept up in the wave of far-right nationalism that Ruda had so skillfully cultivated. The desire to see guerrillists rise to greatness outweighed any concerns about the consequences of their actions. The onslaught continues. Within hours of Ruda's orders, the skies over Tajera were filled with the roar of guerrillist aircraft. The airstrikes were relentless, targeting military bases, supply lines, and any remaining centers of resistance. The destruction was widespread, with entire swaths of the country reduced to rubble. The cries of the wounded and the mourning echoed through the streets as Tajera's people struggled to survive the onslaught. Despite their best efforts, Tajera's air defenses were overwhelmed. The once proud nation was brought to its knees, its military capabilities crippled, and its people left to suffer the consequences of guerrillists' wrath. In a desperate attempt to strike back, Tajera launched a volley of missiles at Hunxi, the guerrillist capital. But guerrillist was prepared. Their missile interception system, one of the most advanced in the world, neutralized the threat with precision. The missiles were intercepted and destroyed before they could reach their targets, but the shrapnel that rained down on the city caused collateral damage, injuring civilians and adding to the growing toll of the war. Ruda's declaration. In the aftermath of Tajera's failed missile strike, Ruda seized the opportunity to address his people and the world. He took to the airwaves, delivering a speech that would send shockwaves across the continent. Standing before the cameras, Ruda's presence was commanding, his voice filled with the fervor of a man who believed himself destined for greatness. He spoke of guerrillas' strength and resilience, of the victories they had already achieved, and of the inevitable triumphs that lay ahead. "This is just the beginning," Ruda declared, his eyes gleaming with ambition. "Guerrillas will not stop until every nation on this continent is united under our flag. We will conquer all who stand in our way, and we will build a new world, one where guerrillas leads, and the rest follow." The speech was radical, a public unveiling of Ruda's true ambitions. For years, he had carefully cultivated his image as a leader focused on justice for President Natsu, but now he revealed his grand vision of continental dominance. It was a bold move, one that galvanized his supporters and sent chills down the spines of those who opposed him. Reactions and dissent. As Ruda's words echoed across the continent, the reactions were swift and varied. In Guerrillist, the far-right nationalist fervor that Ruda had stoked for so long reached new heights. The majority of the population rallied behind their leader, their pride and patriotism fueling their support for his ambitious plans. But beneath the surface, dissent began to simmer. There were those who questioned the morality of Ruda's ambitions, who feared the consequences of a war that sought to subjugate entire nations. They whispered in the shadows, wary of speaking out too openly in a society where Ruda's grip on power was increasingly absolute. In Tajera, President Wiza watched Ruda's speech with growing concern. The realization that guerrillists' ambitions extended far beyond their borders sent a chill down his spine. He had known that Tajera was facing a formidable enemy, but now he understood the full scope of the threat. Ruda was not just fighting to conquer Tajera, he was fighting to reshape the entire continent in his image. Despite the overwhelming odds, Wiza refused to yield to despair. He knew that the fight for Tajera's sovereignty was far from over, and he was determined to rally his people against the looming threat of guerrillist aggression. With each passing day, the need for unity and resilience grew more pressing, as Tajera braced itself for the storm that threatened to engulf them. Leopardia struggled. Meanwhile, in Leopardia, the sudden onslaught from Leonides had thrown the nation into turmoil. Leopardia's leaders, caught off guard by the attack, struggled to mount a defense. The nation's air defense systems, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of incoming missiles, faltered, leaving critical military installations vulnerable. But even as Leopardia teetered on the brink of collapse, Ruda remained steadfast in his support. He dispatched reinforcements and supplies to bolster their defenses, determined to keep his ally in the fight. For Ruda, Leopardia was more than just an ally. It was a crucial linchpin in his grand strategy for continental dominance, and he would spare no expense in ensuring its survival. As the conflict raged on, the once stable balance of power in the region began to shift. Alliances were forged and broken amidst the chaos of war, each nation grappling with the rapidly changing landscape. But amidst the turmoil and uncertainty, one thing remained clear: the ambitions of Ruda and Guerrillist could not be ignored. With each passing day, their influence grew stronger, casting a dark shadow over the continent and plunging it into a new era of uncertainty and conflict. A world on the brink. As the world watched with bated breath, the ripples of Ruda's ambition spread far and wide, leaving in their wake a trail of destruction and despair. In the heart of the storm, President Wiza and the people of Tajera stood firm, ready to confront the challenges that lay ahead with courage and determination. For they knew that the fight for freedom and justice was far from over, and that as long as they stood united, there was hope for a better tomorrow. As nations grapple with the reality of Ruda's ambitions, the world finds itself on the brink of a new and terrifying era.